Oftentimes you'll need to use a database on many of your applications that you build, and you'll have some different choices. In the past I've used SQL Server 2017 and 2019, but those ones aren't, they have their cons, mostly because they're heavy. They require servers to run on, and they are not portable, different things like that. So I've used SQL Server. I've also used MySQL and Postgres and a few others. But what I like for academic purposes and even for light projects is a database called SQLite. And I'm going to make a different video which will show you how to download SQLite and configure it. But it's a really light database that doesn't require much in the way of configuration. It doesn't require a server. In fact, it's called a serverless database. It's portable, very portable, so you can write your application and just move your program around, and it'll work just fine. So it's just a really handy, lightweight application database. If you don't need to worry too much about security, you don't need to worry too much about logs and audits and those type of things that are more suitable for Postgres or Microsoft SQL Server or Oracle or something along those lines. So having said that, I want to demonstrate how to create a SQLite project in Python. And so what I've created is I've created a folder called the temp SQLite demo folder, and we're going to work inside this directory. Inside of a directory that I've named DB, there's nothing. This is where our database is going to go. And here's our SQLite demo.py file, which is, you can see in the background. And so all we have is this empty directory and this blank.py file. And we're going to work from there. So I'm going to go ahead and just minimize this actually. And we're going to start with the first thing you need to do. Of course, this is assuming that you've already have installed SQLite on your machine. And so having done that, then you need to import SQLite 3. And then I like to do another little thing called from SQLite. And what this is going to do, I'm going to use this in a try-catch statement. In almost every programming language that I've used, C++ and C#, they're called try-catch statements. But in Python, they're actually called try-except statements. And it's just a really nice way of running your programs and then capturing any errors that may occur, rather than your screen just blowing up and having some weird feedback. This will actually give you feedback so that you know where to debug and maybe some hints as to what's wrong. So I'm going to write a little bit of code, and then I'll come back and explain it. Okay, so what I've done here is I have my import SQLite 3, and then I create a variable called error. So from SQLite 3 import error, and we're just going to use this to output our errors. And then I created my main function, which is we define our main function, our definition main function here. And inside of it, we're going to create a connection string. So we start off with connection equal none, so nothing's going on yet. And then we have our typical try-catch statement, which in Python is called a try-except. And we're going to try, our code will go here. Now, in the event that there's an error in our code, the error will fall down into the except category and accept error as E, and then it'll print E, which this little block of code means it's going to print out the error, whatever the error is. Now, once that's done, it's good practice to have a finally statement, and the finally says, regardless of what happens up here, whether it works or it doesn't work, we're going to run this block of code. And so it's always good practice to close our connection string once we've opened it. So if it's open, then close it, and then return. So I added the if double underscore name double underscore and then comparator to main to tell the compiler to enter the code from the main function. So this block of code right here, like I've said in my other videos, tells the compiler to enter the code right here at the main. Okay, so we have our good skeleton code set up. This is how you want to start your import, your error, your try except statement and a finally with your return and your and then of course your comparator to send it to the main function. And from here, this is a good skeleton to start almost any project that you do. It's just a good skeleton. Okay, a good template is really the word I was searching for. A good template. All right, so I'm going to write some code in the try catch here, and then I'll come back and I'll explain the code. So I added some code, and the first thing you'll notice is in the try statement, we went ahead and assigned this string to the con. And so con, the string con, now has been assigned, equals means assigned. We've been assigned this string, and we're going to use the SQLite.3 that we imported here, and we're going to use the property connect, and then we're going to pass it the string, this string here, which is the directory where our database is going to be located. So right now, if we look inside that directory, there's nothing there. There is no database. And so the way SQLite works in Python is if the database does not exist, then it creates it, which is kind of handy. So it goes here, it tries to open it, it doesn't exist, fine, it creates the database. And that's what this line of code right here does. And when we call the SQL create function right here, passing it the con, so passing it this information, the SQL create table function, which I created right here, what it's going to do is it's going to come down and it's going to use what's called the cursor. We're going to use the cursor property of the con, and we're going to assign it to the cursor object, is what we're going to call it. And then we're going to run a SQL statement, and then we're going to execute it. Now, a lot of people will put all of this code right here, all the SQL, inside of the execute statement right here. I prefer not to do that because I like to have my SQL string separate, so I can easily edit it and format it, and then just pass it the variable that I want it to run. So I usually call mine SQL string, so SQL str for SQL string, and then I write some SQL code. So when you do this, this is called embedded SQL. So we're going to create a table, and we're going to check and see if it exists. If it does not exist, we're going to create the T1, and then what we're going to do, so the table is going to name T1, and this table is going to have 3 field names, or column names, or attributes, depending on what you like calling them. So the field name object ID, we're going to define that. Object ID is going to be an integer. It's going to be the primary key. It's going to auto increment, and it cannot be null. So that's what this whole line of code right here stands for. Now this little slash you see at the end here, all this means is in Python, it means that the string is going to continue to the next line. So T1, then continue with this line, then continue to the next. So here we have field name first name, and it's going to be of data type text. Continue to the next line. Last name, data type text, and then close. So this is our SQL code that's going to create the table. If it doesn't exist, we're going to name it T1 for table 1. We're going to have an object ID, a first name, and a last name. Then this line of code here executes the SQL string and return. Done. So right now, like I was saying, inside of our database directory, we don't have anything. So let's go ahead and run this code, and should create it. Okay, so our output is nothing because we're not really outputting anything yet. And let's just close that. And if we look at our directory string, we now have our database right here. I named it py_db because I didn't know what else to name it. And here it is. It exists. Okay, so we have created our connection string. We created our try except statement, and we are passing it the SQL create table function, which creates the table in the database that we called T1. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to populate some data into our table. All right, so I wrote some code, and I'm going to explain it now. So right back up in the try catch statement, I created the SQL_insert function. We're passing it the con. You always have to pass it the con so it knows that it's going to use this connection string. And down here, I created this function. Now what this function does is we're going to insert some data. So again, we have to use our cursor object using the connection string with the property cursor. And we are going to use a method where we assign the data first. So we're going to say, okay, what's the data? The data is first name Bobby and then the last name Chapa. The second entry is going to be Sarah Chapa, Jess Chapa, Stan Lee. So these are just our entries. We're going to do multiple entries. Now there is a different method for entering a single entry, but it's not usually the case where we're going to enter one entry. So I wanted to do an example where we had multiple entries. So here's our multiple entries, and we're assigning this whole thing, this whole string of data that's going to be our entries, to a string named data. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create our SQL string. And the SQL string is really simple. We're writing in SQL code, insert into table 1, and then remember this backslash just means that we're going to the next line. First name, and that's for the first column, last name, and then the values. What are the values going to be for first name and last name? They're going to be these question marks. Now in Python, SQL for Python, what we can do here is these mean that we're going to be passing it this information, this data here. So it's going to pass each one of these pieces of data into this insert statement without having to do an iteration. And the way we're going to do that is the property execute many is how that's done. Now if we just had one piece of data, like let's say we were just going to pass Bobby Chapa into the two column names, then we would just write execute right here. We use just the property name .execute. But because we're going to do multiple, we do the property execute many. Then we pass it the SQL string as an argument, which is right here, the SQL string, and we pass it the data, which is right here, the block of data. And then of course we have to commit. Then we commit it and it sends it to the database. So that's it. The SQL insert called from the try statement, and the SQL insert will use the cursor object. We have our data defined, we have our SQL string created, and we pass in the execute many command property, we pass it the SQL string and the data, and then we commit and return. Okay, so right now we don't have any data in there. If I was to run this, the data would go in the database, except for we wouldn't be able to see it because we haven't written a select statement yet. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to write a select statement. Select statement has been written. We're calling it right here in the try catch statement. I just named it a function SQL_select. We pass it the con. Like I said, we have to do that every time. And then right down here we have our select statement. So we have our function SQL_select with expecting the con, and the cursor object as usual with the property cursor. And here we simply say execute. And remember, this is not execute many, just execute. Remember up above we used execute many. This time we're just using execute. We're going to do just one. And here we're saying, okay, what are we going to do this time? We're going to select star from T1. And yes, normally I would do the SQL string here, but since it's so small for this example, we're just going to leave it like this and pass it the SQL string directly. But normally I would do it as a SQL string, as this example right here. Okay, so then in this example though, we need to find the row count. So we look at rows and we say get the cursor object and do a fetch all. What this property does is this goes and it selects everything in, and we get a row count is what this does for us. And for each row in the rows, print row. Pretty simple. And then return. So this is going to pull all of our data that was selected. Now here's where you could put a where clause or an order clause or something that modifies what data is actually selected. But for right now, I just want to go through the different examples of how to use SQLite in Python. Alright, so we should be good enough to run this and see what we get. Okay, so from our database, we got our inputs, the object ID which was auto-generated, 1, 2, 3, 4, the first name, Bobby, Sarah, Jess, Stan, and the last name, Chapa, 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 Lee. So we created the table, which actually was already created, so I just skipped that part. We inserted the data right here in the insert function, and then in the select function, we pulled the data out for display, and this print right here is what what prints this data to the console. Okay. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to go over an update statement. So what happens if you want to edit this data? How do we do that? The update statement has been written right here in the try catch statement. I created the SQL_update function, passed it the con as usual. I did go ahead and comment out the insert statement since we don't want to reinsert our data, because then we just get double data. We get duplicate data, so I don't want to do that. So I went ahead and commented that out, and we're just going to run an update. So what's the update statement look like? It looks like this. In this block of code, we have the function SQL_update, expecting the argument con. We use our cursor object again. We have our SQL string. This time I went ahead and wrote the SQL string. And we're going to use SQL update T1, so it'll be table name 1, set the last name, which is the column name. This is a column name, last name, and we're going to set it to Freddie. But this time I went ahead and used a conditional clause here, the where clause in SQL. So where object ID equals 3. Okay, let's run this and see what happens. Alright, so here's object ID number 3. It was Jess, and the last name was changed from Chapa to Freddie. So we have modified the data in object ID 3, number 3, right here. And this block of code is what did it. Okay, so the last thing I want to show you is how to delete data. And you have to be very, very careful with deletes, because if you don't do it right, you will delete your entire database. So I usually don't delete anything. I modify, but we do want to go through a delete statement. So let's go ahead and do that. Back in the main function, in the try block of the code, I commented out insert and update, and now we have just the delete and the select functions. Create still up there, and it wouldn't matter if I commented out or not. So in the delete statement, we're going to delete, and pass it the con, and then we're going to pull our data back and see what happened. So back here, right down here in this block of code, I created the delete function, and it's SQL_delete, pass it the con, use our property cursor again, and this time I went ahead and wrote the SQL string, and this is what it says: delete from table 1 where object ID equals 3. So we're going to delete that number 3, and we're using our where clause, just like we did in the update statement. Okay, let's run that and see what happens. And here is our output, and as you can see, number 3 is gone, 1, 2, and 4. So that was done using this block of code right here. And that's it. It's pretty simple. Again, you must have downloaded and installed SQLite. I'll create a separate video on how to do that. I do have a video already on how to download SQLite and install it. The only thing is that it continues on and talks about C#, because it's done for a C# video. But the beginning part of that video is the same, but I will recreate it for just as a general one, so it would be the same as for Python or any other language. So as long as you've installed it on your machine, then it's just a matter of importing SQLite right here in order for to access the libraries of SQLite and be able to use it to do these functions. So I'll go ahead and pause on these functions: your update function, your delete function, your select function. Actually, and your update function, your insert functions up above too. Okay, well that's it. I hope that that was enjoyable. And if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the comments section. I'll be happy to answer them.